Hello and welcome to the Practitioner podcast. This is a brand new podcast from us at Renaissance. We're a network of missional practitioners and microchurches in the greater Boston area. Every episode, we're aiming to talk about themes around living on mission and living in microchurch communities. Our conversations, we're hoping, are going to be practical, touching on realities of everyday, ordinary people, just like us. And this is because our mission is about cultivating beautiful kingdom people embedded in the everyday stuff of life. That's what we care about. So my name is Christine Lee, and I am here with the one and only.
Drew Thurman.
Hello, Drew. How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good.
Tell people again, where are you? Did you walk to work?
I didn't walk to work today. There's certain days that I have to take my kids to school, Bree and I's work schedule. So unfortunately, I had to drive today, but I am at Common Good Co. coffee shop co-working space I helped start with Jace Rashi, and I'm in my office.
Yeah, I mean, I was hoping I was going to catch you on a walk day. You're really letting us down.
I'm
So,
sorry. I'm
yeah.
sorry. Yeah. Typically, it's Monday, Tuesday, Thursdays are my walking days right now.
Okay. That's
Yeah.
pretty good. 3 days out of the week.
Yeah.
Okay, so today we're going to be talking about attention, but I feel like it's good for us to start with something that probably takes both of our attention a lot, probably not for good reasons, but I think most of us do this. Our phones. Let's talk about the little black box in our pockets all the time, or maybe in our hands. Um, what is an app that you use on your phone that takes a lot of your attention that maybe it shouldn't take as much attention as it does?
Well, I had to go first last time, so I think you should have to go first this
Oh,
time.
okay. Well, I can go. I'm a little bit embarrassed, but it's a game called Royal Match. I got sucked in because I was playing another game about parking cars, which I'm not very good at in real life. I've run into my garage multiple times. However, I was playing this little parking cars game, and it was like, hey, download this app. It has like a little king that looks like Santa Claus. And I was like, oh, yeah, sure, I'll try
I've
new
seen
little
those ads,
games.
yeah.
Yeah. And I downloaded it, and I'm like obsessed with it. I'm like on level 10,000. Like it's so unnerving when I think about that, how many hours I've spent playing this little matching game. And at first I was like, why is this any different than any other matching game I've played? And I've realized like part of it is like my phone buzzes when you make a match.
Mm.
So it's like the haptics are so good. And I also like didn't really think about it as a problem until I think like it was like in the last couple months I was at like this like friends party or something. Maybe it was like one of my family's like Asian parties where like all the Chinese people conglomerate into one area. And I was like swiping through my little matching game in a corner, and someone's like, "What's that casino game on your phone?" And I was like, "Oh, wait. Yeah, it does look like a casino game. That's
Yeah,
probably why I like it."
yeah. Probably the same psychology of why you're addicted too. Yeah.
Yeah. I was like, I've never gambled besides playing bingo where I won $100 in Vegas. But I'm like, this is a lot more rewarding. I do
Yeah.
like the matching, but I've spent way too many hours. Okay,
Yeah.
that's my confession of the day. What about you?
Mine's actually very random, and I'm sure there'll be some judgment that happens, but I I love to travel. I love maps. My parents say going back to even as a kid, I could entertain myself on road trips looking at the old Rand McNally atlases. I don't know if you remember those things. Like
I
there's
have no idea what you're talking about because I'm young.
there was once these huge, I don't even know, like 24-inch by 17-inch, these huge, thick, but this was pre-MapQuest and smartphones. So if you knew you were going someplace, you actually had to pull out the atlas and like map out where you were going. We always had one just like in the back, in the back seat, like in the little pouches, and I would just
Did it have
stare
a
at that
black
thing.
cover?
No, they would typically have some cool picture of like somewhere in the United States.
Okay, then I really have no idea what you're talking
Yeah,
about. But
they
go
would
on
like
with
put
your
one out
maps.
every year. They'd have like a certain year to it. But I've always just loved geography and maps and traveling. So bring all that together, I find myself on Airbnb all the time, looking at maps of different places I think would be cool to go, and then I just create lists of like you can create wish lists of places.
Okay.
So I don't even know, probably 100 wish lists at this point of different places I would like to go in the world. And like at any point you pull it up and there's like tons of properties there. I've already scouted them out. So people are always like, how did you find that Airbnb? Like I have just happen to stumble upon it, and they don't realize it's been an addiction where I've spent hours that I can almost pull up anywhere I want to go, and I already have properties that I want to stay at. And they
You're an
just keep that.
Airbnb plotter.
I'm a plotter. And I wish there was like an Airbnb travel agent because I would be killing it. I have so many cool spots already mapped out. People could just be like, where should I stay here? And I'm like, oh yeah. Like it's so bad. I've had friends send me properties in New England we should go stay at. And I'm like, that's already in my wish list. I already know about that one. So
That's amazing.
yeah.
Well, y'all heard it here first of this podcast. If you need an Airbnb rec, maybe that's what we should do with this podcast instead. We'll just talk about Airbnb stays. Okay, but tell me why like you like the Airbnb app more than like a Zillow.
Feels more realistic. I can travel. Yeah, at this point, living in New England, looking at houses just feels more discouraging than anything else.
It's kind of
And
depressing.
then, and then on the flip side, I can't look at Zillow listings anywhere else because it's equally as discouraging. It's like, look how much more house I could have for the same price I'm paying now. And so,
Yeah,
yeah,
that's fair.
yeah,
I do feel that way whenever I look at Zillow. I'm like, I could be owning a mansion in like a podunk town in the Midwest, but here I am living in my little duplex. It's fine.
yeah.
Well, I feel like that probably says a lot about both of us. I like a little casino matching game, and you're planning adventures. I'm like, I'm just gonna sit on my couch. It's fine. Um, okay, let's get to the real stuff though. We're planning on every episode, we're gonna go back and forth and bringing the main theme, and we're also hoping maybe down the line we're gonna have some like guests that come in and they'll get to bring the theme too. But today I'm going to start us off, and I already kind of precursored it, but today we are going to be talking about attention. Which last episode we talked about availability, so I think it's kind of like a very natural progression. We're talking about making time, making ourselves interruptible, having that availability, but just like opening up space in your schedule is not enough, right? It's like you could just have some empty space. What does that do? And I think that is why it's so important to talk about this aspect of attention. What are we doing with the space that we open up in our lives? And not just giving our time, but in some ways, like being able to give of ourselves. And I think this theme is really important too for us to discuss as missional practitioners because, like we always talk about the reality of God's agency, that He's at work in the world, that He's doing stuff, and that He invites us to participate in that, right? Like, and so I think it's this idea that if we have a part to play, we have to figure out like how to pinpoint what those parts are, which is why I think knowing how to pay attention is so important. So kind of let's just jump in and get in the weeds a little bit. Let's first start by like defining attention because I feel like we could use it in so many different ways. And so, Drew, I'm gonna pass it to you. Like, how would you define attention? Like, what actually is it, and how does this apply, like your definition, to our practitionership?
Yeah, well, I want to back up and just say I think this is a great extension. I'm glad we're talking about it. I feel like we could probably spend multiple episodes talking about this theme is so deep. I'm sure we're
Yeah.
going to come back to it. And if anyone's been around our community, they have heard us mention this a lot. I often, I think it's gotten to the point where everyone's heard this and can recite it, but I quote Elizabeth Barrett Browning a lot that earth is crammed with heaven and every common bush afire with God, but only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit round and pluck blackberries. And I also write, nobody can see because I can't turn my camera around, but if they did, I have a little chalkboard where I have Mary Oliver's poem, Instructions for Living a Life, where she has seven words and three sentences: pay attention, be astonished, and tell about it. And I think kind of to answer that question, those both lead us, I think, to a really great, especially the Elizabeth Barrett Browning quote, lead us to a great definition of what attention is. That I do think that it's something that takes work. It's something that takes discipline and contemplation, so space for contemplation. That we don't just see things. I think that often when we hear attention, we're just thinking about things that we observe. Maybe the scientific word, to sound real nerdy, would be like external stimuli. Like it's not just that something grabs my attention, whoever's loudest or noisiest, or my phone that buzzes during a game. It's not that I just notice
Yeah.
something because it's flamboyant. Um, you know, it's that I truly see, and we would say from a spiritual level that I think this is why it takes space for contemplation, um, and it takes discipline. It's like something that we cultivate with spiritual disciplines over a long period of time, that we would begin to see ourselves, um, we would begin to see our neighbor, and that we would begin to see creation through the lens of God and his work.
Hmm.
So that there's almost an inner space that we start to find ourselves in. This is where that contemplation and the discipline happen, where um, the information that we're taking in when we see something is not just our own opinions or our own desires or our own wants or our own, you know, based off our own past experience, even, but that it's
Mhm.
based off of God's work and ultimately even what we read in Scripture, what God says about those things. So I think that's really the work is um, they grab my attention, but the information that I'm starting to form in my head when they grab my attention, that I don't just see, but I see,
Yeah.
is it takes that work of contemplation and discipline to get there.
Yeah. I love how you're putting that, and it just makes me think about how this type of attention that you're putting like definition around is like you can't untangle it from love, right? Like
Yeah.
first of all, like if we're going to see something the way that God sees it, I'm just immediately brought to the scriptures in First John where it says God is love, right? And so we see it through a filter of who God is, what he thinks, and God is love in perfection. And I think most of us understand that, like, truly bringing that type of attention, that, like, contemplative, I am really trying to understand, I'm really trying to observe in full and take it into my life. Like, that, that is how you love something, whether it's like music, right? And you're like trying to learn an instrument. Like, you have to pay attention in a sense where it's like you really, like, got to like know it, and know yourself, be able to locate what you're doing, locate what you're producing, right? But also to people, like it's I think like you can't like love somebody without knowing how to really pay attention to them. Like
Hmm.
I'm sure we'll talk more about this. Like we already started with our phones, right? It's like that picturesque. Like if you're at home with your kids or you're sitting with a friend and you're just like scrolling through your phone, you can say that you love these people, but do they feel loved by you? Probably not in that moment because you're not paying attention, right? So I think like to me what you're starting to get at is makes so much sense in being a missional practitioner because we're trying to follow the way of Jesus. We're trying to walk in the way of love, and I think that makes it like impossible to like pull away from this type of attention.
Yeah, and well, and to build on that, I think yes, it absolutely is directly linked to supernatural love. And again, of ourselves. I mean, often and we're going to get to this, I'm sure, we have a hard time sometimes even seeing ourselves and having
Hmm.
proper attention to our own needs and desires and self-worth and our value, let alone anyone else, or let alone creation and the way God's working and all those things. And so, yeah, I think love is a grounding point to all of it. And I do think, and again, we're going to get to this, I'm sure as well. This is why I think art is so valuable and artists are so valuable in our
Hmm.
communities, because artists are typically grabbing you and trying to say, you've seen this, but you've not really seen it. And let me stop and force you to sit with something. Um, and sometimes it changes both how we perceive ourselves, but a lot of times it increases our, if we enter art with the right, again, contemplation and mindset,
Hmm.
helps us actually grow in empathy and compassion and truly attend to others, I think, in the proper way. Eugene Peterson, very famous preacher and author, talks about that this is why he thinks poetry is so important and why he thinks everyone should read more of it. Not only because so much of the Bible is written in poetry, but poets are some of the best artists. Yes, musicians, uh, movie producers and directors do a lot of this as well, but poets often force us to sit, because if you read a poem properly, it's not just about getting meaning out of it. It's trying to sit in the moment that the poet's trying to get you to sit in and observe something in a way that you've not observed it previously. And so that's when we start talking about attention, that's kind of what we're wanting to get to. And so, in a way, our missional practitionership needs to kind of take on kind of an artist type thinking and mindset. And I think maybe even changes how we engage spiritual disciplines in the process.
Yeah. I love that you're going there because I think I want us to start talking about like barriers to this attention. And it just makes me think about how, yes, art and technology can be linked, but there's so much about like making art for the sake of beauty, right? And challenge. And yet we live in the society that's so much about product and progress that's linked to, capitalism, earning, making more. And even like we have a whole thing called the attention economy now, right? Like attention is in short supply and it's been commodified. Like people are literally like building algorithms and products to try to get you to pay attention to what they want you to pay attention about. And I think thinking through that in this kind of culture that we live in where attention is in short supply, I forget, I was, so part of my full-time job, I work for a tech company and I had to do some research about like how many seconds somebody looks at an email before they avert their eyes. And it's like under 8 seconds, right? It's like you need to be able to grab them with that first thing when they open the email so that they keep reading the email for longer than 3 seconds, right? Like it's like we're so frantic. Like we know that attention is valuable, and yet it feels like all of society is like pulling it in every direction. So what do you think are like barriers that keep us as followers of Jesus and really developing this type of attention that's needed to be good for our neighborhood and good for our world?
I mean, I think you already kind of said it. Like, I think you did a great job, like, talking about a lot of them. I think it is the pace of life that we live at. I think it's the technology that we have around us. I mean, those are lots is being written about the fact that it's not only wearing us out mentally, but it's also in many ways warping how we view people because we don't have the proximity and maybe the availability that we would going back to our last episode. But I think also we don't do a very good job, I think, knowing. I think a lot of people are getting better about like, hey, I need to put my phone on do not disturb or I need to step away. I don't think we always, especially in the Christian faith, do a great job helping people understand what they're supposed to do in that space. And so it's like I'm detoxing, but I don't even know like what's a value, what's better than what I'm doing. So I would just want to go back as soon as I get a chance to. And I think even a lot of times the conversations we have around like Bible reading and some of the spiritual disciplines are often aren't framed in terms of attention. It's framed in terms of like how do I get information, or how do I know more of the Bible, or that I've checked something off a list. And I think all of it should be saying like how does this increase my attention? So yeah, we need to have space for contemplation. I mean, most people I don't think ever take time to make inventory of themselves or the surroundings around them, what their day's been like, what their week's been like. How in the world can you attend to something properly if you've never actually had time to like stop and reflect? Like what happened today? Where was I maybe fully present and where were there moments I wasn't? Was there something that I was so busy trying to get something done or get to my next thing that I missed this, I missed God, or I devalued someone's humanity. I didn't see the thing, the way, or my spouse or my kids or whatever it is, a friend. And so I think that's a lot of it is, going back to our definition. I think the barrier is that we don't actually do the work. I don't think we do any of that. And so we're busy and we know we're busy. And sometimes we can shut our phone off for periods of time or step away from the TV, but I don't think we know what we're doing in those blackout times to
Yeah.
actually attend.
Yeah. And I think maybe for those of us that are like not like just that like step one where it's like we've never tried to pay attention before, like you're saying, we're like we've tried, we've shut off the phone, we've done this stuff. I think sometimes we feel like I wonder if we feel like we are not paying attention correctly because it might feel kind of boring
Yeah,
at
yeah.
first. Like, I, I have a friend, I don't remember who it was that was talking with me about this, but they used the term unearned dopamine. And
That's a
it
great
was,
term.
it was like so fascinating in our conversation because they were trying to like weed out some of this like jumping right on your phone right when you get up in the morning, and it's just this idea that like our phones are essentially tools that like zap our brains with dopamine that make us feel good, that make us feel like, oh, I should give more attention to this. But it's truly unearned because it's like my little
Yeah.
matching game, right? I'm like, it feels great every time I make a match and my phone buzzes and I get the colors, but it's like it would take me so much longer to like sit down and have a conversation with a friend and get that type of like chemical rush.
Mm,
And I think like the art of paying attention in our lives to our neighbors, to our friends, to our spouses, to creation,
hmm.
it's like it doesn't feel that good that quickly.
No.
And so I think like that's some of that we have to learn to resist that, to resist just being like, well, it doesn't feel great. So either I'm doing it wrong or it's not worth it.
Yeah. And I think it does. Yeah, I think it's, I think you're right. And I think it takes time. I think maybe the great comparison is like, think of a great, I love to call them slice of life movie, like where you really, it's less about how much special effects or how much they can make the plot move quickly, but you feel like you've walked in someone's shoes for an hour and
Mm,
30 minutes or an hour and 40 minutes. How rewarding it is, like the emotions it elicits in you. And when you walk out of that theater, that feeling
yeah.
that you can't even totally give words to, that you almost like feel like you're heading to the exit and there's just all this is stirring up in you. Like that should not just be happening when we stand or sit in front of the big screen. That should be happening in our everyday lives. And I
Mm,
think so many of us have lost that kind of connection. We've not been forced to get, to truly attend to something or to someone in that way, that we do miss it. It doesn't, it takes a while, but it does feel really good. It's the kind of, maybe another great analogy, like I started gardening the last few years in like a little urban plot, and I didn't think I liked tomatoes. I only had tomatoes from the grocery store. Like I didn't mind like marinara sauce or something, but like just to eat them straight up. And now I realize, oh, I love tomatoes. I just don't like the red pulp that I was buying at the grocery store. It's bland and flavorless. If you actually have a homegrown tomato and you slice it open, it is like the amount of taste, and that it'll like it's sweet and it's tangy and it's juicy. It's like you've got a store-bought tomato, you have to just put so much salt on it to get anything out of it. And I think that's kind of the same thing. Like it's convenient to get on our phone. It gets a quick dopamine hit, but it is that it's having to be doctored up.
mm,
It's a cheap substitute for the real thing of truly embodied living, truly attending to what God's doing in and around us all the time. And so when we do, and once we can start to do that, it takes a little bit of time. The same way gardening took me a while to cultivate something. But once you do, oh my goodness, why would I go back to the other? It's a cheap substitute.
yeah, I love that. Well, let's kind of like dig into what it looks like to really pay attention. And maybe we should talk about it in like two chunks. I think first, let's talk about what it means to pay attention to ourselves. And because I think, like, at least for me, growing up in white evangelicalism and spending a lot of time there, it's a lot of times like we don't talk about this as a part of spiritual formation. And I think like culture is like kind of like on the opposite end of the spectrum about what it means to pay attention to ourselves. So I feel like we should really dive in. So what do you think? Like when it comes to paying attention to ourselves, what's important about it and how do we do it?
Well, as the resident therapist of the two of us, I think this is probably a great place for you to actually begin the conversation.
Well, I think like to me, I I have found in my personal life the importance of like starting with paying attention to our bodies. And I think part of that is having a richer theology that is embodied. Like that Jesus came to us in human form, in flesh. And I, at least a lot of my journey in faith, it's easy to think about spirituality as this like nebulous thing in our heads and our hearts, but like not actually in our bodies. And I have found it to be really important to learn to pay attention to what's going on in my body, what is going on in my feelings and my emotions,
Mm.
and then also in my thoughts. But maybe let me start with talking about my beef with culture because I think because I'm not a Christian therapist. I work with anybody. I find that sometimes there's this propensity in culture to talk about paying attention to ourselves, and it's almost like just this like ego stroking and this like I need to do self-care, like don't bother me, I got boundaries, I need to sit in my bathtub. um and I don't think that's the type of attention we're talking about. Not that like sitting in your bathtub and taking a nice little bath
Mm.
is bad. But I think to me, there's this idea of like, what does it actually look like to love yourself? Like you can pamper yourself, but you might not be loving yourself. You can navel gaze, but then you could just become egotistical and a narcissist. And so I think it's really important to get clear on like why am I paying attention to myself? Like what's this for?
Mm.
And I think it
It's a
kind of goes
great,
back.
that's such a great question.
Yeah, I think it kind of comes back to like where we started with this of like truly the art of paying attention, the heart of it is about love, right? And love is intrinsically relational. And so if we're paying attention to ourselves like just for us, I don't like, like I think that cheapens it. But if we're paying attention to ourselves because we're like who I am and what I have to give to others, to this world, to God, like that's what's important, then yes, of course you need to pay attention to yourself. It's like I don't know, like I'm imagining if someone comes over to my house and I like offer them something that for my fridge, like I want to know what I'm giving them. Like, is it moldy?
Yeah.
Is it good? Like, what is it? And I think a lot of times, like we don't really stop to like pay attention enough to ourselves, and we don't really know what we're offering to others, right? Like, I think there's so much of church language that's like, we want to make an impact, we're
Mm.
gonna serve, we're gonna give, but it's like, what are you giving? Is it anything worthwhile?
Yep, yep.
Like I think that's where the conversation starts for me, at least when it comes to get like paying attention to myself, to ourselves. What about you?
I mean, I am 100% in alignment. I think as you were talking, there were so many things that were firing off in my head that, I agree with. I mean, I think depending on our past experience, yeah, it is important to pay attention to ourselves and saying, you know, what are my desires? What are my needs? What are my habits? Some of that is, some of it's coming from a healthy place of like things that I legitimately need and are God given or callings that God has placed on my heart and life. Other things are destructive and are self-centered and egocentric, and then also maybe coming from a place that I don't believe God's truth about myself. And so,
Hmm.
this is where like reading stuff like from Henry Nouwen or Brendan Manning has been so, transformative in my life because I grew up
Yeah.
in a very similar, like just sweep all that stuff under the rug and God is good and you just need to get over it. And the heart's
Let go and let
deceitful.
God, baby.
Yeah. Just like very unhelpful. Yeah. Um, Things that have been said to me in the past. And so I think, yeah, it's really wonderful for us to be able to peel back the layers and say, do I truly believe in my belovedness? And some of my
Hmm.
actions, even things that maybe are socially acceptable things, are actually showcasing that I'm not actually aware of God and what God says about me and where God's leaning in to dwell with me and wants me to be seen and known and loved. And then beyond that, like we're going to talk here in a second, I think so much of awareness when it comes to others and creation is decentering our own ego. Well, I actually have to, and so decentering self. So I actually have to know myself. So I without, like, I'm almost attending to attention in a way. So if that makes
Hmm.
sense, it's kind of an inception there. But I'm actually, I have to first like be very aware of who I am. And I think if you've ever taken emotional intelligence test, that's what like we always think of it just in like I think we truncate what emotional intelligence is. And if you've ever taken like the EQI test, there's four different quadrants
Mm-hmm.
of like different places that you can score higher or lower in. Um, and so, like, I first have to have some self awareness as to myself, my own needs, some of the maybe the good or bad ways that I react to things, my own past experience, the way that it shapes how I see the world, so that I can actually try to move past that. And
Yeah.
so that when I see my neighbor, I have the, again, this is where the contemplation comes in, that I actually have the ability to stop and say, like, no, I know that my knee jerk reaction to my neighbor is because of X
Mm-hmm.
experience that I've had in the past, or it's a trigger for me because of this past past neighbor that I've had, or the worldview that I've shaped in where I haven't been around people like that a whole lot. Like
Mm-hmm.
that takes that there's a lot of awareness that's happening there in the self that then allows me to move beyond myself to start to say, how do I lean in and start to see this person for who they really are and how God sees them. Like there's a lot of layers of work that's taken place there. And so I think that's why it's so important for us to kind of come from a healthy place and a healthy self knowledge of ourselves, because I don't think we can ever truly give the gift of awareness of anyone else if we haven't done that work for ourselves.
Yeah, that's so good. And I will say, like, we can't experience God or anything outside of our own selves, right? Like it's like we
Yeah.
will experience the world, we will experience God, we'll experience others through our bodies, through our feelings, through our thoughts. And so like you're saying, like trying to understand that and paying attention to how we process those things, I think is so important. And it just like makes me, maybe an example I'll give is like I always talk about, I work with a lot of clients about like emotional identification. Like so many of us like don't even know what we're feeling. It's like
Mm,
so interesting. Like someone will tell me a story and I'll be like, "Oh, like well, what do you feel about that?" And they'll immediately go into like some other caveat, like a thought they have about it or what someone
mm,
else did in the story. And it's like it's really hard I think for most of us to be like, "No, like what do I actually feel about that?" And I think part of it is like one, it's our society is very like weird about vulnerability, and I think emotions make us feel vulnerable, makes us feel like exposed. um, and I have found that like just like you're saying, just because you feel something, like I to me it's an important data point of understanding the world
mhm.
and understanding God, and of course understanding ourselves. Like but it doesn't necessarily mean like my first reaction or my first emotion is like the end all be all, right? Like I think we most of us, if you're to think about yourself, we land on one side or the other, right? It's like we either like
Mhm.
completely like kind of ignore our emotions, or we're like, yeah, like my gut instinct is so good. If I'm mad about that, God's mad about that. Like, like it's like the all the people that post on their Twitter like Jesus flips tables, so me too. And I'm like, okay, well, I think we need to be a little bit more contemplative of like, would Jesus flip this table? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
And so like I think this is probably because of my own stuff. Like anger has been an important emotion for me to unpack in my own life. I think because like I'm a woman of color, so it's a lot of times been discouraged, right? Like I shouldn't showcase anger very often. But it's also, I think, on the other side of it, whenever I tap into, I'm feeling angry about something, I don't want to just be like, well, yeah, I'm right. I should feel angry about this. God's cool with it. Because there's a lot of scripture that talks about, you
Mm,
need to be careful about anger. But there's also a lot of scripture about God being angry about stuff too. So I don't think it's bad. But when I learn to pay attention to my anger, I've been thinking about it. Like, this is a really good data point because anger signals something's wrong for me. Now, my perception might be incorrect. Like, I might think somebody, maybe I feel wronged because I totally misunderstood what was happening. But maybe I do understand something about this. Maybe something is off, right? And
yeah.
it's like it takes that like second layer of exploration to get underneath it. But we can only do that if we pay attention to the first layer, which is I'm mad. Like
Yeah.
I'm mad about this. And so I think like that's why it's so important to learn to pay attention, to
Mm,
identify what you're feeling, identify what you're thinking, identifying where that's happening in your body, because it's like that's what gets you to be able to dig deeper. Like you don't get into that second spot without first being like, "Oh, yeah, I actually feel super embarrassed right now about that." So
mm,
what's happening?
mm,
And I think a lot of us like don't do that work because we're like, "Ooh, like I don't want to get overtaken by this. I don't want to become like lost in the sauce," right? But I'm like, it's so important for us to be able to say, "No, like I feel upset."
yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
what's going on?
Oh, good. Well, I mean, there's so much richness of what you're saying. And I think I've quoted it, maybe, I don't even know like how many times, but I instantly was thinking of Willie James Jennings' book, Christian Imagination, and his conversation about the grotesque nature of Christian social imagination and performance that operates above like place and land and
Hmm.
animals and others. And I think that's almost what you're like, I think sometimes even I think this happens from a non-Christian level, but even from a Christian level, I think so many people have been given just like a very black and white like card to play, and they just want to slap that, and they almost operate like my emotions don't matter, me being a part of this, like I'm not a part of it, I'm above
Hmm.
it because I'm a Christian. It's,
Hmm.
it's this sacred secular divide.
Yep.
um, and that has implications both for themselves and for neighbor and creation around them. And so
Hmm.
there's actually no work of attention that's actually taking place there. It's just confirmation bias. I've
Yep.
already decided the lens and the framework that I'm going to look at everything and everyone, and I'm just going to put you in those categories. And I think
That's
this is
so
why
good.
probably this scares us so much, and I think why we don't even do the work with ourselves, because I think we would begin to realize just how complex and nuanced God's work is in the world, not
Hmm.
only around us, but like we're answering in this question in us. Like there's a
Yeah.
lot to unpack. There's a lot to peel back. Some of my emotions are very valid. Like,
Hmm.
this is, but I think it's part of the reason like we don't do things like lament very well
Right.
because, we just want to push past it. Like, yeah, we just got to keep advancing the gospel. Like, no, like it's okay for us to mourn and say, this is not right. This is not the way God created it. That feeling in me is valid and I should pay attention to it and should
Hmm.
stop. Um,
And it helps us understand God more, right? Like
Absolutely.
it's like when we learn to do things like grieve and pay attention and mourn, it's like, well, it seems like if you look throughout the narrative of scripture, God grieves a lot. God mourns a
Yes.
lot.
Yes.
And is someone that is all powerful, has the ability to do
Mm,
anything and everything, and still chooses to grieve and mourn and engage human beings in their lament. It's like, well, if God is doing that, what does that say about how we should experience the
mm,
world and ourselves,
yeah.
right? And it's like when we bypass that, we lose, like, I think we lose so much, if you want to put it this way, it's just data points and understanding God.
Mm,
Like, and I
yeah.
mean, for me, just like you, like, I think that's been a lot of like my faith upbringing. It's just like, it's just the good stuff, right? Like, it's just like
Yeah.
hope and rah rah and like we're killing it and God's so good. And it's like, it's not that he's not those things, but it's just, I think it's richer when you're like, he is so good and he is very much in touch with the pain
Mm,
that you're feeling, your neighbors are feeling, whatever it is, right?
yeah.
Well, let's kind of jump into the second part of like, just like what we were talking about, we pay attention for ourselves, not just for the sake of ourselves. I think this means that we need to learn to pay attention to things beyond us, in particular, others and creation, and ultimately God. So why don't you start this time? Like, what do you think this part involves?
Yeah. I mean, I think if you've done the work in the first part, I mean, they're not mutually exclusive. They kind of work together. It helps you move past yourself. I think that the work of attention is moving past our own ego, our own biases, our own, you know, even sometimes even wants and needs. We're being able to move past that to see as God sees. I often quote a lot. There's a early 20th century philosopher and spiritual kind of Christian mystic named Simone Weil. I won't go into her whole life, just incredible person. Her literature has shaped me so much the last couple of years, but she has a really great, several awesome books, but one of them is called Love in the Void, where she uses the story of the Good Samaritan, and she spends a lot of time talking about what is the difference between the priest and the Levite, the first two that come upon this man who's been robbed and left for dead on the
Mm.
side of the road, versus the Samaritan who shows up. And we often get caught up in the work that happens, all the great ways the Samaritan serves this man. But in essence, they all three see. Like we know the priest and the Levite notice him and actually move to the other side of the road in Jesus's story.
Right.
So attention, according to Simone Weil, is not just, again, what we went back to at our definition, this observation of an external stimuli. Like it's more than that. It's, and like if we even give them the benefit of the doubt, maybe they even felt like, a little bit of like sadness for them, like, well, that sucks. Glad I'm
Mm-hmm.
not him, sort of thing, and moved on. But we know they had religious ritual and cleansing ceremonies they would have had to go through. It would have been very inconvenient, and for them to stop and to help this man. Again, centering themselves and ironically, even ministry work that they wanted to accomplish. What's the
Right.
difference is that the Samaritan shows up and doesn't just see, but sees,
Mhm.
has done the work, has the time to contemplate. It literally, the Greek word there says, like translated, is literally empathy or compassion to the bowels of being, is what the
Mhm.
Samaritan feels according to Jesus. Literally decenters himself, his own agenda, his own schedule. There's a racist ethnic component there that the Samaritans and Jews didn't
Yeah.
like each other. He's a Jew, and literally is able to move past all of that. There's a financial burden that ends up, being accrued. There's like a lot that goes on there. Simone
Mhm.
says it's all takes place in true attention. Going back to your version of love, like here's a man who sees his neighbor and says, like, she even says, like in that moment, humanity doesn't even exist on the roadside until the Samaritan looks and says, this is someone
Mm.
made in the image of God with infinite value and worth. And the same as me, made of the same stuff as me. If I was in their shoes, what would I hope someone would do for me? And then
Mhm.
begins to enact this incredible creativity off of that attention to do all these wonderful acts that's not even asked for, goes above and beyond what we could ever imagine. And so I think the work that we're talking about in this question about what does it look like to pay attention beyond ourselves is
Mhm.
that work of saying, like, I know myself well enough, and I've done the work that I can move beyond myself,
Yeah.
to truly see someone else the way God sees them, can begin to imagine the kind of work God might be calling me to in this moment where his agency is at work. And ultimately, I think we can extrapolate that to all of creation. That I
Mhm.
begin, and I think this is part of our problem. We often only see creation in terms of how we can utilize it or harness it for our own well-being. What happens when I begin to see even all of creation? I don't just see it; I see it,
Mm.
and it's not just useful, but that it's something of infinite value, because it's attached to God and His creation. So I think there's so much we could do there, but uh, it is a work of letting ourselves and our own egos go, which probably is going to take us the rest of our lives, and we still probably won't get there, but it's going to be a constant work in progress.
Yeah. And I think part of my brain went to like my counseling school stuff, where I remember one of the first things we talked about and learned about was clinical empathy. And I think a lot of us think of empathy as, like you said, like just being able to see ourselves in someone else's shoes, which I think is a good thing to do. But in counseling school, they really challenge us. They're like, no, true clinical empathy is being able to see somebody else in their own shoes.
Mm,
Like, and it's really understanding what they think, what they feel, what they're experiencing through whatever is happening, right? And I think that that distinction has actually been really important because for me, it's really challenged me that I'm actually not curious enough. Like,
mm,
I think because probably my personality, I think I'm a pretty intuitive person. I've realized though I fill in the gaps a lot about like, well, this is how I would feel about that. This is like what I would think about that. And it's like, well, maybe they don't think or feel like that at all, but I'm not
yeah,
noticing because I'm just
yeah.
like, yeah, like that this is how anyone would probably feel about it. And
Mm,
I'm just thinking about myself really. And it's not like malicious. I think it's
mhm,
very natural, and it's also a good thing to be able to be like locate yourself in what someone else is experiencing, but I think that only goes so far, and especially like figuring out what it looks like to be a missional practitioner in,
yes.
I think especially in our context, very secular, very post-Christian. It's just we need to be a little bit more curious, I think even just trying to understand somebody else's worldview, like, and a lot of times like that's it's discombobulated, right? Like a lot of people aren't a part of like institutional religions anymore. They're just spiritual. So it's like, well, what does that mean?
Yep.
And they
Yep.
they have a lot of beliefs, they have a lot of thoughts, they have a lot of like instincts about the way the world works, and that really shapes the way they feel and
Mm,
think about
yeah.
certain situations or how they process their pain and their grief. And so I think for me, it's been, I would encourage all of us to just consider like maybe I shouldn't just guess essentially like
Yeah.
how,
Yeah.
or like take how I would feel about something, how I process something, and just blanket it
Mm,
on another person. I think a huge part of learning to pay attention to our neighbors and to others in our lives, well, as like even like people that we know really well, is like, well, but like, what do you think or feel about that?
mm,
Like, what are you seeing in that? And I think most of us would be surprised if we learned to ask those questions. It's like, oh, it was not what I thought you were
mm,
thinking or feeling. It's not how I thought you were experiencing that. And I think like that's such a simple thing, but like just learning to ask, like, oh, what do
mm,
you think about that? What do you feel about that? What did you see in that situation?
mm,
Instead of just assuming and telling ourselves a story that we actually don't have very many
mm.
facts to back up.
Well, I love that. And I think, Simone's example in the book is someone who uh, is unconscious. They can't talk. So
You're
they're,
correct.
and so I love that added level that you're giving because, um, you know, most of, you know, yes, creation's a different story. But when we start talking about our neighbor, we start talking about those that we rub shoulders with. I love that clarifier of what does it look like to, yeah, not center ourselves in someone else's skin, but rather allow them to, and I can only speak of someone who, I've not been married nearly as long as other people, but I think that's been the work of, so much of the work of marriage. And I think you could probably extrapolate this out to close friendships that I've had as well, that you get to know someone well enough. And as you begin to ask clarifying questions, you almost, there's this consciousness that it's almost like, I know that person well enough that I know, not me, how they're going to feel about it or how
Hmm.
they're going to respond to it. What happens when we start to do that with others around us? And to the maybe a very easy antidote is how often we've maybe gotten to know someone and you're like, oh, you are not what I thought you were at all.
Yeah.
Like, and we're so surprised because we had already created that narrative. We based off of our past experience, based on how someone dressed, how they act, maybe previous experience with someone who looked and acted like them.
Hmm.
Um, what gender they are. We can go on down the line. Some of the other like signpost of maybe a brand they're wearing or the way that they fit inside a social bubble or social norm.
Hmm.
And we begin to assume a lot of things. And I think what you're getting at is that attention is those extra clarifying questions. It's that true listening that I love you earlier. You said data point, that we
Hmm.
begin to create true data points, healthy data points that helps us not only see them for who they really are, but also helps us that middle space of allowing God to speak to us, not rather than us just based off of our past experience feel like we know, we've attended because we've just decided.
Yeah. And practical tip, I feel like I teach this communication skill a lot for people I work with, but I mean, I try to practice in my own life too. Is like when you're talking with someone, finding some way to essentially express like what I'm hearing you say.
Mm,
Like, and I think also clarifying, like, did I hear you correctly? Is this like what you're saying? Like,
mm.
because I
You're
think,
really good at that, by the way, much better
oh,
than me.
thanks. Well, it's because I practice all the time. I do have 12 concentrated hours every week where I try to practice. But I think like more than anything, as I've like practiced it more and more, it is just interesting. Like I think the thing that always comes to mind the most to me and I know is when people say no. Like, and that's been like
Yeah.
really good. It's like
Oh, that's
sometimes when
awesome.
I'm like asking someone, I'm like, okay, so like this is what I think you're getting at, and they're like, no, it's not. And it's like I thought I was like really doing a good job paying attention, and I thought I was getting it. And when you have like that relational trust, and I think that's part of it too, is what you're saying is like we have to build the relational credibility for people to be able to like push back on us too. But I think if you can kind of pair that with, I want to get to know people more than like superficially. I want to pay attention to them. I want to really listen, want to know, I want to
Mm.
see. And then like just practically like when you're talking with someone, just say like, "Oh, like is this what you're saying?" And like hopefully as you're building deeper friendships, relationships, people will be like,
Mm.
"No, you're not getting it." And that's actually really good. Like
Yeah,
because
yeah.
I think one, it's like internalize that. Let yourself be challenged and say, for me, I think it's what's helped me check my gut a lot. Like my gut's not always right because I'm like, honestly, I think I'm pretty good at listening a lot of times now.
Mm.
But I'm like, still, that's not what that person was trying to tell me.
Mm.
And I think that for me has been a game changer of like just try to ask and then really notice when someone's like,
Mm.
no, you're not getting it. That's not quite it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know this isn't the point of this episode, but I think often, like, I feel more seen and known every time you ask those questions because I get to clarify as well. Oh, like, because sometimes you'll leave a conversation or leave an interaction and be like, ah, I don't did I come across the way I wanted to come across, or did they really get it? And it's so wonderful for someone to stop and like actually help you be seen and known and fully be able to express, have a healthy interaction that way. It is such a wonderful gift. So such a practical piece of advice. And I think that's where we need to kind of wrap up this episode, is giving some more of that practical advice of how all of anyone who's a practitioner listening to this episode can start to take some first steps towards attention. So is there any others you could think of besides responding that sort of way?
Yeah. I think like we kind of hit this at the beginning, but I feel like super practical. Use that do not disturb button. I know that's like this first like surface level in some ways, like just because you put it on doesn't mean you're actually paying attention, but I do think like I've tried to use it a lot when I like go hang out with friends or when I'm like on a call or whatever it is. And I just feel like it's just like one for me. It's worked. It's like a signal of like I'm really trying to pay attention right now. I don't want any other things to tell me, notify me. And I really want to like try to lock in. So I feel like that for me is like I know it's not like a game changer end all be all, but I would encourage those of us like just try to remind yourself when you're entering into conversations, when you're having dinner, when you're, whatever it is, just like put the phone on do not disturb. What about you?
I think those are great. I think for me, like, just pulling back the curtain completely, like I struggle with some spiritual discipline practices. I'm not always as great. I mean, I try to do it still, but not always great with reading my Bible or prayer. Like I try to do listening prayer. I'll do forms of Lectio Divina, but I really do well with practices on the go.
Mhm.
And I used to feel really guilty about it, but I think there's, now, so things like art. Again, I mentioned it at the beginning. I think it's a really easy, like, I don't think we view it through the lens that we should view it in all the time. I actually have a
Mhm.
whole other podcast where this is the whole point of it. It's called Finding God in Culture, and we spend time looking at art and trying to discover God.
Mhm.
Those burning bushes in art that we take off our shoes because we're on sacred ground. And I think for a lot of people, like you're already watching Netflix, or you're already going to the movies, you're already reading. What if you or listening to music? What if you built in some moments of contemplation along those way, like along the lines, like what is this making me feel, and where like what am I seeing in someone else? Where is this challenging maybe my own preconceived notions about? A lot of times right now we have a lot of art that's really trying to push the bounds of how we see other people. So I think it's a really, especially with film and TV, very easy way for us to start to think through that. But I think also like I'm constantly trying to create awareness practices, both of God, of self, and of neighbor beyond that. So I've been walking my neighborhood. You started asking me that. Walking my neighborhood has been transformative. We actually have a tool at Renaissance that you can map Lectio Divina, this sacred reading of the Bible where you're trying to hear God and see Him in the text, where you can map those same practices onto your neighborhood, walking your neighborhood. That has been transformative for me to like take my almost mile walk to work and back, and sometimes take some detours with the eyes, not just with my AirPods in, but with my eyes open, trying to take like, how do I feel about some of this? God, where are you at? What am I taking in about my neighborhood? What am I noticing?
Mm.
Those have been really good. And then other moments, like sometimes it's a walk, but if I'm in the car, not always throwing on a podcast or music, but spending time allowing that to be, I'm already in the vehicle, I'm already going from point A to point B, to be a point of inventory. We talked
Mhm.
about prayer of examine, in the last episode, but I think, just trying to take inventory, like, of some of my interactions that day, taking, thinking through some of the people that I've chatted with, some of the things that I've noticed. How did it make me feel? Where did I feel like I joined God? Where did I see God? Where did I miss him? Where did I miss a
Mhm.
moment to truly attend to someone else? Just having those moments, I think on the go have been really helpful for me because that are all framed around attention. And I feel like much more like I know the ecology of my place more and some of the people in it than I ever have.
Mm.
And it's been really helpful for me to not feel guilty that they're not all with me with my face in the Bible, or in on my knees in an hour of prayer, and that God is using those in another way to shape and mold me into His image.
Yeah, that's really good. I think you're the one that shared this quote, and I might be misquoting it, but something about like how attention is almost like the highest form of prayer. Am I?
Yeah, it's a Simone Weil quote. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think to me, like that's like when it comes to paying attention to God practically, like I think that's maybe what you're getting at is like
Hmm.
it doesn't have to be like a like it's not that it's bad to be like I'm gonna sit and journal out my prayers or like be really intentional, but it's also like how do we it's that pray ceaselessly. It's like I remember hearing that as a kid, I'm like, how do you do that? Like I gotta
Yeah.
do other things. But instead it's like what if you just acknowledging God's presence
Hmm.
and the ordinary things in your life that you're doing. And there's this like really good Henry Nouwen quote. I think it's in the book In the Name of Jesus where he talks about or maybe it's the way of the heart, but he was just talking about how a lot of times we view prayer as either like talking to God or like thinking
Hmm.
about God.
Yep.
And he says that that both of those types of prayers are products of culture in which high value is placed on mastering the world through intellect. And I
Hmm.
think that to me, that's really poignant because I mean, I do that a lot where I'm like, I'm just trying to understand something. I'm trying to like get my brain around it.
Yep.
And I'm like, I want to do that with God. It's like, and I realize I'm like, I think I think it's natural. I think we all do this, or maybe I just have a disorder, but I just want to control it. Like, I want to be in
Oh yeah.
control of my life. I want to be in control of what's going on. But if prayer can be something deeper and in some ways more ordinary, and I don't have to like intellectually grab onto anything, but I can just receive, I can just be, then maybe I'm more okay with
Hmm.
myself, with others, with the Lord. Like I think one example I have is like this the past couple weeks have been I've had a really hard time emotionally with just everything happening in our
Hmm.
country. I've just felt very stressed. And I think I've noticed that where I'm like I'm not usually a person that feels that way. Like normally I have opinions about things or some thoughts, but I'm not someone that feels like distressed
Hmm.
about stuff like events in the world like this. And I'm like, but I have felt very distressed. And I like this is gonna make me sound like holier than thou, but it's not. Like I literally whipped out my journal. I hadn't written it for like
Hmm.
7 months, but I'm like, I'm just gonna start writing in the morning because I feel so stressed out.
Hmm.
And like was writing in my journal, just like I've been writing a lot of imprecatory prayers out from the Psalms, so that's a little insight into me. We're talking about that anger again. But it was really interesting because I noticed that as I was writing stuff down, I just felt really tearful. Like
Hmm.
I felt really like tearful at first, just like angry and scared and sad. And then I decided I was like I'm gonna start pairing some of this like just like trying to read a little section out of some of the gospels. And
Hmm.
for whatever reason, I just like was in Luke 4 where Jesus announces his ministry through Isaiah 61 where it's like the spirit of the Lord's on me and going through that passage. And I just noticed I was like right when I saw those words, I just felt even more tearful. But
Mm,
like, but like, but I felt this sense in my body that it is safe to cry.
mm,
And I just was like, I think God is meeting me. I
mm,
think God is trying to tell me something about
mm,
myself, about the world. And it doesn't fix anything, right? Like I'm like it's not like the things I'm stressed about are no longer stressful or no longer happening. It's not that like anything like tangible like I can point to succinctly has changed, but I'm like no, I think God is with me. And I don't know what to do with that necessarily or
mm.
what's the next step, and I think that's okay too.
Yeah,
But for me it's like this way of like paying attention of like oh, it's just maybe that God wants to meet me. Like,
exactly. Well, I think
right?
it goes back to that quote you just gave from Simone Weil. Like it's not a utilitarian thing that you
Yeah.
can harness. That's the the attention is the highest form. It's like that I am connected to my creator, to God who designed me to be that way. As you were talking, I was thinking, I mean, one of my favorite authors of all time is Frederick Buechner,
Mhm.
who talks about the importance of listening to our lives. And I don't think he's just even talking about ourselves, he's talking about all of our lives. We're embodied creatures that we should touch, taste, smell our way to the hidden and holy heart of life. Because at the
Mm.
final analysis, all moments are key moments, and all of life is grace. Our very existence. I mean, he would say, so I think elsewhere, but I think I'm getting this from him. I'm paraphrasing, but it is a fathomless mystery. The fact that I even exist, that I wake up every day, that I recognize that I wake up every
Mm.
day, and that I have the ability. We're really some of the only creatures that can really truly move beyond ourselves to
Yeah.
understand what's going on around us, not just in terms of survival, but in terms of purpose, in terms of meaning.
Hmm.
We should sit with that more often. And I think that's really what we're getting at when we get there as missional practitioners. That's transformative. I mean, so many of us on this journey, part of the beauty of what we do at Renaissance, it's not some magic fairy dust that we sprinkle or anything, or we have some great formula. It's just that we give people the space to attend to their own lives
Yeah.
and to their own surroundings. And then you'll hear people say, I feel more like myself than I ever have. Well, it's because that's what you were designed to do.
Hmm.
And this Christian journey that we're on is more than just what we can accomplish. It is more than uh, us just trying to put our head down and get through. Uh, it is about us dwelling with our Heavenly Father, who we've been designed to be in relationship with, and in connection to His creation, community, and to the natural surroundings around us. And when we actually have space to do that, and be fully embodied and connected there, surprise, surprise, we, going back to what we said earlier, it's a little bit better than our smartphones. Um, it'll be transformative. And I think when we talk about cultivating beautiful kingdom people embedded in the everyday stuff, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Not just people that do a bunch of crap, but people that are actually showing up and seem fully alive because they're fully aware of what's happening all around them, how sacred it really is.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect way to end this episode. I couldn't have said it better myself. Well, thank you everybody for joining us and listening. We are excited to continue in this new podcast journey with you and walk through the realities of following God in the everyday. If you want to learn more about the Renaissance Network, whether it's about our microchurches or our future cohorts, you can head to wearerenaissance.org. We would love to hear from you. If you have thoughts, hit us up. We want to know. And without further ado, bye.